We're in Quark's, where he and Odo are antagonizing each other for a giggle. Odo sees Jake head up to one of Quark's holosuites and assumes the worst, raising some serious questions about what he thought the bat and catcher's mitt were for. Jake's off to play sports ball, as Quark explains, potentially heralding a pivot away from programs that involve fluid extraction now that he's getting a different sort of clientele. Or maybe there's not that much difference after all. Bashir's talking to Dax about how he can't get her out of his head, though doesn't clarify which one. Dax is under no illusions though, especially when Bashir's been noted with a number of other companions. Plain simple Garak doesn't feature on the list, but then you'd expect as much from an expert in espionage. Dax leaves the doctor to tend his swelling and reports for duty. There are some weird wibblies coming out of the space fog they're next to, possibly caused by the uptick in traffic going through the wormhole. Nothing dangerous yet, but something to check out. To O'Brien, where in a curious turn of events, he's not being worked to death. A bedtime story of Rumpelstiltskin gets Molly nice and excited to prevent her sleeping, but he and Keiko leave her anyway. She's out of her room shortly after and saying Rumpelstiltskin is in there, so O'Brien tries to put her back to bed, only to be greeted by a visitor. Sisko is called to O'Brien's quarters after security can't solve the problem, but he doesn't get there. He's stopped by Jake, who's been followed home from his sports ball game by one of the holograms. And Bashir's having a bit of a weird one as well. He's woken from a dream by Dax attempting to seduce him, and assumes either she's ill or he's hallucinating. Being called to ops makes him assume it's a practical joke, and he leaves his quarters. The two arrive together to be introduced to a sports ball player who's been dead for centuries, and a fictional character who's been dead for infinity. Sisko asks Dax if it might be related to the Wibblies she was looking at earlier, but Dax doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, that Dax doesn't anyway, but the one that just arrived does, on account of her being the original. Our new guests aren't much help at figuring it all out. Bashir says they're all very real according to his scans, and each believes themselves to be so as well. Sportsball Guy certainly doesn't have any idea about being a hologram, and remembers stuff from his past games. The common theme, thinks Sisko, is that they all came from someone's imagination, which I guess means it's lucky that Fantasy Dax is wearing clothes. She's still fawning over him until he tells her to cut it out, at which point she simply vanishes. No time to ponder that one this early in the story, so we're interrupted by Odo. He's on the promenade, where it's snowing. Sisko doesn't have an answer for him beyond calling in as much security as possible and sticking the station on yellow alert. Dax has been doing a science to the Wibbly while all this is going on and has found blah 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 science bollocks. Sounds like a good time to fart a probe at it, so we do that, while Odo calls back to let us know the snow is now an emu. I'm not sure if that's better or worse. There's a similar bit of good news, bad news in Quark's as well. He's imagined himself up a couple of ladies, but having his attention on them has distracted him from the fact that his customers keep winning, and he's going to end up destitute. I'd have cut out the middleman and just imagined the Latinum myself, but I suppose that's missing the point of gambling. Elsewhere, we're still tracking that Wibbly. Bashir says something about protons, which puts it at a fairly comfortable 4 on the Star Trek danger table. That means we're sufficiently safe to have an awkward chat about him conjuring up a fantasy Dax. She brushes the whole thing aside, saying she understands and that, in a way, he's the person who's been wronged for having his fantasies paraded. They drop the topic for precisely 4 seconds. Yes, I timed it, because Dax is either genuinely curious about how Fantasy Dax behaved, or, more likely, just wants to stick the boot in. If it was the latter, it backfires spectacularly. Fantasy Dax reappears and fawns over Bashir some more, while trying to convince real Dax of what she's missing. It's the computer that saves Bashir from his torment, as it's found something similar to our current Wibbly in the historical archive. Another star system reported the same thing over a century back, a good potential source of data for what's coming, which will be very useful as the system in question no longer exists after the Wibbly ate it. The probe's ready and we shoot it into the Wibbly. Rumpelstiltskin's needling O'Brien, perhaps to try and distract him from finding a solution. He'd disappear in that event after all. And maybe that's why he makes a thinly veiled threat about Molly, then disappears. As threats go, it's not a very well thought out one. The Wibbly is eating all the matter around it and getting bigger, so Molly's in danger regardless. But that idea of distraction isn't just Rumpelstiltskin from the looks of things, as Dead Sportsball Guy is trying to get Sisko to go and play. When that fails, he tries to draw Sisko into a discussion about what they'll do if he doesn't disappear, and then another about the game. It ends amicably enough at least, with the guy thanking Sisko for coming to watch his games as he leaves. Dead Sportsball Guy has things to do himself anyway, specifically catching up with his mates Rumpelstiltskin and Fantasy Dax. They both complain this whole thing has been a waste of time, not understanding why their targets would create characters they reject, but Dead Sportsball Guy thinks he's getting somewhere with Sisko, and wants the observation to continue. Let's hope it's not for long, as the Wibbly's still expanding. We learn a little more data about the system that was destroyed by something similar, and how a science ship farted a firework at it. The result, a few minutes later, was the whole thing massively expanding, kabooming the ship and the entire star system with it. After that, the Wibbly contracted back in on itself and disappeared. Despite this, O'Brien thinks sticking a firework into our Wibbly is still the best option. We've got better toys in the last 200 years, he says, which is curious when we established earlier that the last event was 100 years ago, but let's ignore that for now. Either way, Bajor is screwed if we don't stop this, so what do we have to lose, other than time to evacuate as many people as possible and potentially prevent the extinction of a species? It's a frankly shite plan, but it's the one they've got, so we're doing it anyway. That'll mean the station is going to take the brunt of anything untoward, so we're evacuating the outer areas. As soon as Odo's finished with imaginary emus, anyway. Things are starting to get out of hand. Kira imagines one of the docking pylons being destroyed, only for it to snap back to reality when she goes to report it. Quark still being a dirty little bastard, presumably while his business is going bankrupt, though I wouldn't be surprised if his establishment has gambling terms and conditions that excuse him from accountability for acts of Wibbly. Even Odo's having a bit of fun with it, albeit briefly. Dead Sportsball Guy is learning the limitations of his power, though. He's trying to convince Jake to ignore his homework and come play ball with him. Jake knows how that would work out with his dad, though, and imagines the inevitable conversation. The fantasies leave, and Jake continues his homework. Let's pop back to Ops, as we're now ready to shoot the Wibbly. Sisko sticks on the mood lighting, and we fart out some fireworks. Kabooms go kaboom, eventually, and things seem to be working. Then they're not working, and bad stuff happens. A few bits of the station use up our pyrotechnics budget, and some things stop working, one of them being a shield generator, so Odo is asked to evacuate the area. Worse, or perhaps better if they're responsible, is that Fantasy Dax is in a bad way. Treatment from Bashir doesn't stop her from either having a nap or doing a dead. No time to worry about that though, as the Wibbly is now loads bigger and still increasing. Nobody knows what to do, with the exception of Rumpelstiltskin. He can fix it with his magic, as long as we're willing to pay his fee. There's no need though, as Sisko thinks he's figured it out. The Wibbly didn't get dangerous until Dax started investigating it, just at the same time our new guests appeared. And during that investigation she'll have imagined the things it could have been. Things like the space-eating Wibbly that it became after she read about the similarities to one in the past. Hell of a gamble, and even more of one when Sisko decides to prove his point by dropping the shields and telling people to believe it isn't real. Dead Sportsball Guy and Rumpelstiltskin disappear, as does the Wibbly outside. Fantasy Dax, who's apparently not done a dead, also disappears after a final compliment. All that's left is the initial tiny, unexplained Wibbly in the space fog next to us, and we'll check that out properly instead of imagining what it could be. That investigation perhaps becomes irrelevant when Sisko goes back to his office. Dead Sportsball Guy reappears and says imagination is something his people are finding difficult to understand. They're from the Gamma Quadrant by the sounds of it, tailing a ship back through the wormhole to explore, and they've decided to learn through observation rather than contact, as they've had some unpleasant experiences in the past. Whether those experiences were unpleasant because they pulled stunts like this isn't mentioned. Still, it has been useful to them, so that's good, I suppose. Sisko wants to know more about them, but Dead Sportsball Guy says they're leaving. Seems like a terrible exchange to me, but at least he gets a souvenir out of it, so we'll leave Sisko to think and play with his ball, until the next adventure. I have a theory. I think that long scenes where people talk science wank without anything of real interest happening are a pretty good indicator of a script that underran being padded out. And I think that underrunning is generally a fair indicator of a central concept that either wasn't thought out enough, or didn't really have the legs to be a full story to begin with. In this case, I'm not sure it's option 2, as the central nugget of aliens trying to understand an aspect of our psyche has some potential. That leaves option 1 and the suggestion that somebody had the idea, but wasn't quite sure what to do with it to make it a viable story. If we're being ungenerous, that's following a bit of a theme. This is hardly the first episode of the season that feels like a script pitched for the next generation that sat in a drawer for a while because nobody was sure how to make it work. As I've said previously, maybe that was intentional to keep the feel of TNG, but it doesn't help a new show find its own feet, and it certainly doesn't help convince new viewers of the quality. Fair to say then that I was not a fan of this one, but there are a couple of noteworthy points, so let's go over them. First off is Odo saying he has no sense of smell. We've not really covered how Odo's senses work, but we do know there must be something decidedly non-humanoid going on. He's previously turned into a glass to overhear a conversation, and a painting to watch somebody hack a console, so we know the senses he has aren't linked to standard humanoid sensory organs. That opens some questions about what he can sense and how, but I think the more interesting implication is that he expends an inordinate amount of energy pretending to use sensory apparatus that probably isn't doing anything. When he looks you in the eye, that isn't an eyeball, it's just a coloured section of fluid rotating to align with you. Maybe he's using it to see, maybe he's not, maybe he doesn't even see in the same sense that we do. What he definitely is doing, though, is pantomiming a response, so the people around him feel more comfortable. There's probably a giant tangent to go on there about the parallel with autistic masking, but that's likely something that would run to a length requiring its own video, so we'll leave it there for now. The last little nugget of data in this one is also from Odo, but not about him. As he's gaining the attention of punters in Quarks, he uses the line "ladies and gentlemen" before adding "and all androgynous creatures" when he sees persistent barfly Morn. The implication, of course, is that Morn, or his species in general, is androgynous. Incidentally, I use he there as it's been established in the show on a couple of different occasions. This isn't the first time Trek has unintentionally stumbled into gender representation, though some believe this was intended as a joke. That doesn't ring true for me, given how many species we've encountered that don't conform to what was then perceived as binary norms, even before you add that it would feel out of character for Odo to be mocking someone without cause. Regardless, it's a minor nod to inclusion, whether it was meant to be or not, and, for me, that's worth a point in what was an otherwise lackluster outing. End of episode.
Is this going to be a theme from now on?
Look, it's not my fault, it's biology and all that.
Speaking of which, how did you need to go again anyway? We've not had a chance to eat since we got here, and there's no way you had anything left in you after the docking bay fiasco.
You're a cartoon dog with a skull for a face. Looking for narrative logic feels a bit redundant, to be honest, mate.
Sigh. I'm trying to get us out of here by explaining that the earlier problems were a misunderstanding, and you're here doing dirty protests all over the cell.
They're not all over, there's just that one there.
And all the ones you stuck to the ceiling.
I told you, that's an art installation.
We're never getting out of here, are we? Woof.